give you a bit of an introduction here for those playing the home version, because you're not just an armchair scientist. You are a key figure in climate science. Certainly one of the most decorated and prolific researchers. I did some of my own research. I found more than 130 peer-reviewed publications that you're responsible for. You've got a long list of national and international honors. That includes the MacArthur Fellowship Genius Award, which was awarded to you for your pioneering work in climate fingerprinting. You've got an E.O. Lawrence Award. And I did learn something else kind of new. You have an H index of 77 with more than 30,000 citations. And for anybody who doesn't know what an H index is, an H index of 77 means that you have at least 77 papers that have each been cited 77 or more times by other scholars. So the University of Texas MD Anderson Library explains that an H index is calculated by counting the number of publications for which an author has been cited by other authors at least that same number of times. An H index of 77 signals a very high level of sustained productivity and certainly influence. You were featured in the 2014 documentary Merchants of Doubt, which was inspired by a book of the same name by Naomi Oreskes, the PhD science historian from Stanford University. And Ben, you've even crossed over into pop culture with an appearance on late night television a few years ago. You were on Late Night with Seth Meyers to pretty much rebuke something that Ted Cruz had said about climate change, right?
Yep.
And you and I are talking right now, and there's a few miles between us, but I have a feeling if we were to do this again, either at the end of the year or next year, there would be even greater distance and perhaps a larger ocean between us. Can you sort of talk about what is on your agenda in the next few months and what has led to this decision?
Well, first of all, thanks, John, for allowing me to use my voice in these chaotic times. In answer to your question, I'm planning to move to England. There are two reasons for that. One reason is my partner lives in London and I want to be with her. The other reason is that since November 2024, the second Trump administration has tried to dismantle the entire scientific enterprise, not just climate science, but many, many other branches of science, vaccine safety, cancer research, you name it. I decided right at the beginning of the second Trump administration that I was going to use my voice and I was going to publicly speak about the many harms caused by the anti-science policies of the administration. That makes me a target. It makes it difficult to continue doing my research in climate fingerprinting, which we'll probably get into in a few minutes, without fear of serious negative consequences for my colleagues. Until recently, I've had colleagues at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, close to Boston, and at UCLA. I've collaborated with them on a number of really cool things. Say, looking at the impact of human-caused climate change on fire weather, which I did together with my UCLA colleagues, or doing what's called fingerprinting in the ocean, trying to use pattern recognition methods to separate human and natural effects on stuff we care about in the ocean. Think ocean surface temperature or the vertical structure of temperature in the world's ocean basins. The key thing is I can't continue to do that kind of work now without serious and justifiable concerns about my colleagues and their funding and whether their visas might be revoked. I want to continue doing science, and I can't do it safely anymore in the United States. That's the second reason why I want to move to the UK.
So you mentioned the dismantling of science in general. You and I are speaking right now on July 31st. So Thursday, 2 days ago on Tuesday, July 29th, there was an announcement by the EPA the rescinding, and I hope I get this correctly, endangerment findings of 2009. Number one, is that an example of the dismantling of science that you are referring to? And then number two, what exactly was the endangerment finding of 2009, and what does it mean by rescinding such findings?
Is it an example? Yes. So as you correctly pointed out 2 days ago, EPA Administrator Lee Selden announced the EPA's intention to try and rescind the 2009 endangerment finding. That is one example of a whole palette of harms that this administration has caused. What are other examples before we get into what the endangerment finding is? Hey, how about firing thousands of employees from NASA, from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, from CDC, from many, many government organizations, EPA. I know most about the harms in the climate space because that's what I do. And many of my colleagues have lost their jobs, particularly younger colleagues, probationary employees who were in positions for less than 2 years. NSF, the National Science Foundation, has been gutted with many, many employees losing their jobs. NSF being told, hey, you got to vacate the premises now and move to some other building. Goddard Institute for Space Studies, an iconic climate modeling center in New York that was above Tom's Restaurant where they filmed Seinfeld. They've been told, you got to vacate the building. Funding for the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab in Princeton, one of the iconic climate modeling centers in the United States, if not in the world. Funding for them cut by Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick for, quote, creating climate anxiety in America's youth by producing climate models that inform us about human influence on climate and likely future outcomes. All of this I would categorize as significant harms. The endangerment finding and efforts to rescind it now, as of Tuesday, is but one harm in a long line of harms. So getting now to what is it? When we burn fossil fuels and produce heat-trapping greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, we warm the planet. We warm the surface of the earth, we warm the surface of the oceans, we warm the lower atmosphere, the troposphere. There are really well-established links between warming close to the surface and things like ozone pollution. And ozone pollution, smog, those kind of things have critical impacts on human health. Think asthma, think all sorts of pulmonary issues. So it's a good idea to limit emissions of greenhouse gases, to limit warming, to limit the production of pollution where we live, and to improve human health. That was the basis for the endangerment finding, that restricting emissions of greenhouse gases from motor vehicles and from coal-fired power plants would be beneficial for human health. And that finding in 2009 by the Supreme Court gave the EPA the legal wherewithal to regulate emissions of greenhouse gases. That is what is now being challenged by Lee Zeldin and the new leadership of the Environmental Protection Agency. They want to rescind the endangerment finding and make it easy for people to pollute with impunity.
How in the world of climate science, in the world of science, which you are much more intimately connected than I am, how big of news is this? And be dramatic as you can. Is it devastating? Is it shocking? Is it where are we with this?
It's not shocking because This is what Trump said he was going to do. And this is part of this infamous Project 2025, this conservative blueprint. Before Trump was elected, this is what we're going to do. You know, the argument underpinning Project 2025 was first Trump administration, they didn't really have a plan what they were going to do. We don't want to be in that situation again. The architects of Project 2025 said, so here's a plan. And part of that plan is everything I just described. Dismantling the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, cutting funding for climate modeling, firing researchers at key government agencies, shutting down satellites that inform us about how and why our climate is actually changing. All of this is in progress. Everything that was in the plan is now underway, and challenging and rescinding the endangerment finding was part of that Project 2025 plan.
Were we on a path from 2009 in a certain direction, and we were getting a response from the climate that we were actually hoping or expecting? And now with this rescinding, are we on a whole new, different, unknown path and actually headed back into more danger?
Unequivocally, yes.
Okay. So
we were under the Biden administration on a trajectory to ramping up clean energy, providing infrastructure, say, for EVs, encouraging the development, building out the development of wind power and solar power and other renewables. All of that is in the crosshairs of the new administration. They seek to repeal everything that Biden did in terms of building out clean energy infrastructure. And through rescinding the endangerment finding, they seek to give fossil fuel companies carte blanche to pollute. And they seek to roll back, say, CAFE standards, vehicle emission standards. The insidious thing about these efforts to rescind the endangerment finding is they seek to do it in a bomb-proof way, in a way that a future administration, even a green Republican administration, could not easily reverse what is now being done to the endangerment finding. And that's the challenge, right, for all of us. Should these folks be allowed to jeopardize human health and well-being by giving polluters carte blanche to do whatever they want for a long time to come? Or should folks in red and in blue states whose citizens are imperiled by climate change, as recently in Texas or in North Carolina with the Asheville flooding, should they have as their prime directive not towing the line with regard to what the administration wants, but protecting the citizens in their state? So that's the challenge here. And every legislator has to decide, what's my prime directive? Is it to protect the people who voted for me? Or is it to give the fossil fuel companies more benefits?
So then, to use a real simple sort of metaphor for what you just kind of said about, say, a Republican Green Party coming in, it's very easy to dismantle a skyscraper or a building of any size. Demolition, bring it down. But to build that building could take years. Is something like these climate change restrictions and endangerment findings, is this somewhat similar? It's very easy to destroy what we've already done, but if we wanted to go back, it would take a lot longer.
That's the concern here, John. I think that the moves on the chessboard that are already underway have long-term consequences. I'll give you a couple examples. So if you go after the National Science Foundation, which funds foundational scientific research in the United States. You take away grants, you cancel grants for stuff you don't like pesky climate science, or anything related to DEI, anything that has the words clean energy in it. When you do that, even if those decisions are challenged in court, because in some cases the funds have already been appropriated by Congress and dispersed, and now the administration is illegally withholding them. When you start to do those kind of things, people have mortgages. They gotta pay the mortgages. They've got to continue to do something. So if the grants are held up, what do? They might leave science. They might go to Europe. They might go to China. They might decide that there's no academic future for them in the United States. You make it unattractive for students from foreign countries to study here. They don't feel welcome. They don't feel they can express themselves freely. The consequences are long-term then. You make it more attractive for students to go to Europe than elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And you diminish the pipeline of new talent, of the best and the brightest here. You diminish work in certain areas, critical areas for us, understanding the reality and seriousness of climate change, figuring out novel vaccines, finding novel cures for cancer. We're effectively handing off the baton of leadership on those areas and on clean energy development to other countries and saying, here, you lead. We don't want to lead anymore. Mm-hmm. That is a recipe for disaster. The leaders of the 21st century are going to be those who figure out cheap, efficient ways of providing low carbon energy to the world. The leaders aren't going to be those who said, make coal great again, make the horse and buggy great again. We're not going to lead if we try and take the United States back 40, 50 years.
Right. It sort of begs the question of what's the economic impetus and what are the economic consequences of a decision like this? Because I want to say that in 2009, maybe even we'll go forward a little bit to 2015 with the Paris Agreement, if I'm getting that right, that business almost said, okay, emissions are bad. Let's change our business plans and make some changes in our industry. And there's economic input and consequences to those decisions going back over a decade that all of a sudden now we have to switch again.
It's insane. I mean, one of the things, as I understand it, that Biden's Infrastructure Reduction Act did is it gave a lot of money to red states for the development of clean energy infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Trump seeks to undo all of that mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. to the detriment of the people who voted for him. Mm-hmm. It's ideological. It makes no sense economically, scientifically, politically. It just seems so overtly ideological. I'm going to undo everything that my predecessor did because I don't like him and I don't like this woke stuff. And my base approves if I do this kind of thing and throw them red meat. Economically, politically, scientifically, it's insane.
Is that who they're pandering to, their base, by making a switch like this?
In part, I think, yes. In part, this is what you get when you don't educate citizens about basic science and the reality and seriousness of climate change and how and why our world has changed and what the dangers are associated with unabated fossil fuel burning. If you have an informed, scientifically savvy citizenry, not a citizenry that is kept ignorant or that is kept fearful, vote for me. I'm the only one who can solve all your problems. I'm your savior. And don't believe anything these pointy-headed academics say or scientists. They're they all have their own woke agenda here. When you break that curiosity of folks about how and why the world is the way it is, and what a changing world, a complex world, means for them personally, for their lives, for their jobs, for their well-being. When you keep them in ignorance and in darkness, then you get America in 2025.
Mm-hmm. Is it wrong to assume that some of the findings and data that went into the endangerment findings of 2009 are based on some of the work you've done and going all the way back to 1995?
Yeah, it's fair to say that. So the endangerment finding relies on information in part about how we know it's us. How do we know that human-caused fossil fuel burning changes the chemistry of the atmosphere, the levels of CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases? How do we know that stuff? And how do we know about the consequences of those changes in the atmosphere for our climate? And that's what I've worked on for my entire life. I started doing that kind of work in the late 1980s at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg in Germany. That's where I had the privilege of working with Klaus Hasselmann, then one of the directors of the Max Planck Institute, who would later go on to win 1/3 of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2021, in part for developing these pattern recognition methods, now called fingerprint methods, that help us to disentangle human and natural effects on climate. And in the late 1980s in Hamburg, and later in the early 90s, when I moved from Hamburg to Lawrence Livermore National Lab in California, my job was to develop and apply these fingerprint methods and to disentangle the climate changes associated with us, human-caused fossil fuel burning and deforestation and particulate pollution, from the purely natural stuff. Think volcanic activity changes and changes in the sun's energy output and stuff we know and love in California, like El Niños and La Niñas, natural fluctuations in the climate system. That was my job, to figure out how to isolate the human fingerprint on climate. And I did.
Can you comment real quick or explain real quick what you mean by fingerprinting? Is it exactly what you're saying it is? When I think of a fingerprint, my finger touching something and you pull the fingertip and you can recognize a pattern, whorls, ridges, so on and so forth. Is climate fingerprinting pretty much the same thing?
Very similar, actually. So in forensic fingerprinting, no two fingerprints are exactly the same. Everyone has some unique characteristic pattern of whorls and ridges, and there are many different categories that people use to partition different types of fingerprint.
Mm-hmm.
The same in climate space. The key thing is you're looking at patterns. So if you look, for example, at temperature changes from the Earth's surface right up to the stratosphere, the top of the stratosphere, 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface, and you think, well, there are solar cycles. The sun's energy output varies on timescales of roughly 11 years and longer, and those do something to the vertical structure of temperature. Volcanoes do something different. When you have a big volcanic eruption like Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in June of 1991, it pumps a whole boatload of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere and some aerosol particles as well. And that does something very different to atmospheric temperature, that big volcano, than the sun does when its energy output varies. So that gets back to the fingerprint. Those patterns looking through the atmosphere are different, just like your fingerprint is different from mine. And pattern recognition methods exploit those differences to separate observed temperature change into a component associated with the sun and volcanoes and human-caused greenhouse gas changes and natural variability that's just intrinsic to the climate system associated with things like El Niños and La Niñas, because each one of those things has different patterns.
I want to sort of, nail home the significance, precision, and accuracy of the science that's involved in what we know about the climate, because I'm very curious as to what the argument used by the current EPA to rescind the findings in the first place. There seems to be such strong evidence. Now, you're more scientifically literate than I am, but there's overwhelming evidence to support the human influence in climate change. What is the argument that was used on Tuesday to rescind the endangerment findings?
Well, two things happened on Tuesday, this last Tuesday. One was this press conference that EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin had to announce that the EPA was going to try and rescind the endangerment finding. The other was the dropping of this report from my former employer, the U.S. Department of Energy, and the report had been commissioned by the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, to perform a relitigation of well-understood science. So under the first Trump administration and now, there have been calls for a red team, blue team adversarial reassessment of climate science. And this report that dropped on Tuesday from the Department of Energy is without the blue team. It's just a red team perspective where noted climate change skeptics who have been proved wrong for their entire scientific careers wrote in 150 pages everything that displeases them about current climate science and the findings of the National Academy of Sciences and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This report is awful. There's no other word for it. For example, in my arena, I mentioned vertical fingerprinting, that one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for human effects on climate is this prediction that was made back in 1967 by Suki Manabe, a very eminent climate modeler at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab in Princeton. And he did, back in 1967, a very simple simulation where he increased CO2 in the atmosphere from 150 to 300 to 600 parts per million. When he did that in this simple model, he found that the increased heat trapping CO2 more effectively trapped heat in the lower atmosphere, the troposphere, and the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, cooled in consequence. This is 1967. We don't have the satellites to determine whether he was right or not. We have some weather balloon measurements of atmospheric temperature, but most of the weather balloon measurements burst above about 20 kilometers because the weather balloons don't have the structural integrity to go high up into the stratosphere. So Manabe could have been wrong about this prediction. Increase CO2, warm low down, cool higher up. What we found, and many other people have found in the last nearly 60 years, is that Manabe was right. The satellite data, the weather balloons show this unique characteristic fingerprint of warming of the lower Earth's atmosphere and very pronounced cooling of the upper atmosphere. No natural cause can do anything like that. So in this report that was released 2 days ago, the authors of the report actually cite some of my most recent work in this area of vertical fingerprinting, but they completely misrepresent it. To give you an example, it's like if I say that color there is black, and here's a study that I've published over the last year showing that this color is actually black. In this report, they say, no, that's an interesting study, but the color you found is actually white.
So, okay. So when you say the red team only, and it's funny you say that there's two things that happened on Tuesday, because this announcement from the EPA, was this other announcement of the red team only sort of strategically released at the same time to be
Of course.
hidden?
Of course.
So
no, it wasn't. It was overt. I mean, the challenge to the endangerment finding mentions this Department of Energy report, so there was linkage there. They're not disconnected things.
Okay, they're not disconnected, but it just so happened we're a little bit more quiet about this red team only report.
Well, the reporting is now starting on this because what I just described, the complete and utter misrepresentation of the work that my colleagues and I have done in vertical fingerprinting, my experience is not unique. So dozens of folks whose work has been cited in this 150-page report are now being asked, hey, your work was cited by the media. Was it cited correctly?
Mm-hmm.
And the bottom line story in Wired magazine, in Science magazine, in a number of different news stories that have come out just since Tuesday is, no, we weren't accurately cited. This report fundamentally misrepresents what we learned and what we published. So it's not a scientifically credible document, and it's unreviewed as well. Mm-hmm. It had some anonymous reviewers. We don't even know whether they were really scientists at the Department of Energy, but you compare and contrast something like that with a National Academy of Sciences report or an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change science assessment that are reviewed up the yin-yang by hundreds, even thousands of people. There's no comparison between this report and the assessments that we've made of the science, the entire community, for many, many decades.
It's almost like Tuesday was all prosecution and no defense. They said on Tuesday, you know what, for the last 58 years, you've always thought the sky was blue, but guess what? It's green. You were all wrong. And we really don't have any studies or any strong scientific evidence to tell you why it's green. We're just going to say it's green from now on. Everybody else is wrong.
That's what it feels like. It feels like gaslighting. Again, in terms of my specific example, we claimed that we could identify a human fingerprint in satellite measurements of atmospheric temperature beyond any reasonable doubt. Mm-hmm. Nothing natural could explain this huge cooling of the upper atmosphere that had been predicted by Manabe in 1967, while simultaneously warming the lower atmosphere. Not the sun, not volcanoes, not El Niños, not La Niñas, nothing. Mm-hmm. And then this report says that the satellite data that we looked at in this paper in 2023 actually don't show this fingerprint. Mm-hmm. They just assert that. Right. They assert that models can't simulate the kind of things that we actually found when we looked at models. So I struggle to, other than gaslighting, to find a word that accurately encompasses this kind of behavior. It's alternate reality. It's the sense that each of us gets to define our own version of what reality actually is. Right. We don't. This isn't the first time something like a red team has come up. Back in 2014, you were part of actually a more balanced presentation. I want to say a red team and a blue team. Can you comment on similarities and differences between what you just said and what you experienced in 2014? So what I experienced in 2014 was this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had just come out with its fifth assessment report in October of 2013.
Can I pause you real quick? Maybe I jumped the gun a little bit. You talk about the assessment reports, the fifth one. Can we step back a little bit further to illustrate your involvement with the IPCC and numeric assessment reports? Again, I'm going to bring up 1995, you being the convening lead author of a second assessment, and then carry us forward to 2014.
Sure. In April 1994, I was at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. I had joined relatively recently. I was a junior scientist, and I was invited by the IPCC because of the fingerprint work I had done at Hamburg and when I first came to Livermore, to be what's called convening lead author of Chapter 8 of the IPCC's second assessment report. That report was eventually published in late 1995. And the chapter I was in charge of was Chapter 8. It was entitled Detection of Climate Change and Attribution of Causes. The purpose of that chapter was to say what we knew about the causes of climate change. And after a year and a half of work, our team of roughly 24 authors from all around the world found that the emerging science of climate fingerprinting allowed us to say that we had formally identified a human-caused global warming signal. And that led to this famous 12-word sentence in the 1995 report, quote, "The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate," unquote. It was the first time that the international scientific community had spoken with one voice and had said formally, hey, something unusual is happening. A lot of powerful individuals, companies, and even countries didn't like that cautious, even wimpy balance of evidence suggests finding.
These 12 words have caused some fallout and some problems.
Yeah, and if you want to read about them or see a reenactment of the problems, go watch Kyoto. Kyoto is a play by the Royal Shakespeare Company and Good Chance Productions. It premiered last year, and it's coming to New York, to the Lincoln Center, in October and November of this year. And the play partly covers my experiences in and after Madrid.
Is there a coincidence that's called Kyoto, or is there significance to calling it that?
Yeah, there's a significance because the play is about the Kyoto Protocol. You know, at that conference, the countries of the world decided to limit the emissions of greenhouse gases. And one of the precursors of that December 1997 Kyoto meeting was Madrid, 1995, provided some of the scientific evidence for countries to get together and say, there really is a problem. We can now already see it in the data, and we've got to come together and sign an agreement to limit emissions of greenhouse gases. Amazingly, even the Saudis signed that agreement. And that's part of the political drama that took place in Kyoto. Involves the United States and the Saudis and small island nations and people with very different perspectives on the problem, and the Global Climate Coalition is trying to sabotage everything. It turned out that what happened in Madrid, where these 12 words were finalized in November 1995 in the beautiful Palacio de Congresos de Madrid, didn't stay in Madrid. You know, these 12 words were earth-shaking in retrospect because the fossil fuel companies and the Kuwaitis and the Saudis recognized this was the handwriting on the wall for them. Scientists were saying, hey, this is real. Fossil fuel burning is causing harm. Harm is going to amplify to our climate system the more we continue to do this. So they engaged in a deliberate scorched earth strategy. That's the phrase that's actually used in this play Kyoto, to go after the scientists involved in the finding, and the IPCC and try and destroy them. No personal animus, but if you can't win on the science, then go after the individuals involved, try and destroy them. And that's what I encountered after the balance of evidence finding in November 1995.
Right. You had some personal threats and attacks. Am I correct?
I was investigated by Congress, by former Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. The sources of my funding were scrutinized. Why I had been allowed by the Department of Energy to work for the IPCC was investigated. There were calls for my dismissal with prejudice from my position at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. It was rumored that I was going to be indicted by the Hague International Court of Justice for, quote, falsification of internationally relevant scientific documents, unquote. It was a bad time.
Yeah. So what is happening today with the colleagues whose science in 2025 is being hidden and dismantled? Is something you have experience with almost 30 years ago.
Yeah,
They're being attacked much like you were.
Unfortunately, the attacks are more systematic now because we have the internet, right?
Yeah. And you had mentioned, just a few minutes ago when we were talking about peer review, these 12 words didn't just spring out of your head and come from nowhere. All of the work that you and these other scientists did in completing this draft of the assessment went through peer review before final publication. And peer review is a very rigorous, robust process. So to be taken out of context is not an accurate or an appropriate statement at all, because it was scrutinized for months. If you started in April and it was published in November, you're looking at a year and a half of scrutinizing from other peers.
Not only from other peers, but the entire world. So the review of this document was a multi-stage review. The zero order draft was peer review by expert in the field. Then there was another review, and then eventually the full country review, where every country participating in the IPCC got to say what they liked and what they didn't like and what they wanted changed. And that was not just the official representatives of that government, but also NGOs. So I had to deal, for example, in my role as convening lead author of Chapter 8 of the 95 report, with comments from the Global Climate Coalition and from Greenpeace and from Ford Motor Company and from, all ships at sea, basically. And you had to respond to each and every comment and explain why you did or did not make certain changes in response to that comment. It was like peer review on steroids. A typical peer review of your scientific paper, you have maybe 2, 3, maximum 4 reviewers. This is hundreds and hundreds of reviews over a very long time. And that's what led to this historic 12-word finding. And it was historic because fingerprinting had just emerged. People had recognized in the late 80s and early 90s the power of fingerprinting, the discriminatory power that you could use it to really try and separate, disentangle natural and human influences. And that was a huge insight. And that's what led, I would argue, to this discernible human influence finding. So
with that background and that foundation, bring us back up to 2014 with the red versus blue and why and how that contrasts to what just happened with red only.
Yeah, so I would say back then in 1995, that's when my involvement with the forces of unreason, as I call them, really began.
Okay.
Because as a scientist, you're trained to think that other people respond to evidence.
Right.
that facts and evidence matter, and if you can present others with credible information about, say, causation, fingerprinting, address their concerns, look at uncertainties, it will be influential. You'll be able to persuade others if the science is compelling enough. But in 95, I recognize there are people who are resistant to evidence, who don't care about it, who just want to win. You know, one gentleman wrote me back in early 1996, congratulations, you've won the game, after the 12-word finding came out. He was a climate change skeptic. I wrote back and said, this isn't a game. We're doing science here. Right. For him, it was a game to be won. And for many of these folks still today, that's the way they see it. It's a game. It's not about advancing scientific understanding, doing the right thing for the country, and figuring out the most efficient and cost-effective way of protecting all of us from harm. It's a game that they want to win.
You know, is that skepticism and conspiracy theory to science, is that relatively new? I mean, you mentioned a systematic dismantling because of the internet. I mean, I remember being around in the 80s, and we never thought about flat Earth versus spherical Earth. But now it seems to be everywhere. Was there a time where, like in the 80s, like you said, I thought if I had evidence and facts and data that this was going to be an open and shut case, but all of a sudden there was this birth of controversy and disagreement. Is that something that is only growing and getting worse?
I think it's gotten much worse since those early days in 1995. Anyone with a keyboard can write any kind of stuff that they want to about climate change. They read a few things on a blog, they're instant experts, and they can try and make your life miserable. They can submit Freedom of Information Act requests. They can whip up their followers to a frenzy of hatred and try and make your life difficult. All of this has happened to me. It's not some abstract hypothetical here. So you multiply that by hundreds and thousands, and you see the difficulty of doing climate science in the modern world. If you work in certain areas like causation, like attribution science, and you come up with findings that others don't like, say, hey, human-caused warming is changing vapor pressure deficit, which affects wildfire weather. If there are people who don't like that, they can make your life miserable and make you miserable and devote a lot of time and energy and money to doing that. That's new. I didn't have that back in the mid-90s, but now it's an occupational hazard. It's part of being a climate science in the modern world, at least in the United States.
Well, and it almost seems like this isn't limited to just climate science. Like you said in the beginning, science is under attack. I can't help but think of the early days of COVID, when facts were coming out about death, about sickness, that there were certain talking heads on TV that said, no, what you're seeing isn't real, look the other way. It doesn't exist. It almost feels like we're doing that, and there's a crossover between just distraction and dismissal versus the facts and data that are right in front of us.
You know, you put your finger on it with COVID. You would think, again, that any administration, even an ideologically motivated administration, would want to protect its citizens, keep them from harm, keep them from dying.
And the word protection is in the Environmental Protection Agency.
I know.
EPA, yeah. The P in EPA stands for protection.
Yeah. But as we saw in COVID, that's not the case. And that's not the case here, too. So there's this lesson that we learned back then, that ideology is somehow more important than protecting lives. There are eerie parallels between the beginning of COVID and the challenges, say, to climate modeling. I'll give you an example of that. So near the beginning of COVID, folks in the epidemiological community were doing counterfactuals. They were looking at this R naught. They were looking at the information that we had about the spread of COVID and trying to look at the efficacy of different intervention options. So if we mask and we do this intervention, what are the likely consequences for the spread of the disease and for deaths? And they used epidemiological models, and they used multiple models in order to do this kind of work. That's exactly what we do in climate modeling, where you have simulations with and without human influence on climate. The world without us, is called a counterfactual. And that's what people were doing in COVID. President Trump dismissed counterfactuals as, quote, a political hit job, saying that these were enemies out to get him. This is the way science is done. You try and bound an effect by looking at how things might behave with and without that effect, that intervention, that increase in greenhouse gases. That's basic science.
Mm-hmm.
And what epidemiological modelers encountered at the beginning of COVID was just so familiar to me.
Right.
This was exactly the same thing. Oh, can't trust models, and they're all unrealistic, and you don't know anything. It's this resistance to trying to understand stuff that is vital to your own health and maybe even survival. That's what I can't wrap my brain around.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've written before that if we choose to ignore climate change and make cuts to research, that our poorest and most marginalized and most vulnerable communities are probably going to bear the brunt. Can you elaborate on which populations are most vulnerable when the climate data itself disappears? And, how does that widen sort of the existing inequalities between those communities?
I'm not expert on this. The Union of Concerned Scientists has great information to this very topic about access to healthcare and income, and the overlay between that kind of basic demographic information and climate risk associated with wildfires and flooding and more intense hurricane. Mm-hmm. And there's, not surprisingly, a strong overlay between some of the most vulnerable areas to climate change, say low-lying areas in big cities. That was one of the problems with Hurricane Harvey back in 2017. Harvey dumped about 60 inches of rainfall on the city of Houston in the space of 3 days. And as has been shown subsequently, that enhancement of rainfall was on us. For every 1 degree Celsius warming of the atmosphere, we get about a 7% increase in moisture. And we've seen more intense flooding associated with severe storms and hurricanes because we're operating from a moisture atmosphere. And in the case of Harvey, much of the harm was in low-lying areas of the city of Houston where poorer populations lived. They bore the brunt of the damages. Think New Orleans as well, and Hurricane Katrina. There are many examples. Think how many people who can't afford to live in areas of the city have sort of gravitated towards areas of higher wildfire risk. There are these overlays between vulnerability and income and access to healthcare that are real. And taking away that kind of information, not allowing people to make informed choices about where risk is greater, which is what this administration is doing, is unconscionable.
So you would agree then, maintaining a robust climate science infrastructure supports public health agencies, whether it's preparing for heat waves, worsening air quality, disease outbreaks, because as we've discussed before, some vector-borne pathogens can live and not live in certain climates. As we continue to build and encroach on certain open spaces, Lyme disease and deer ticks are going to be closer to us.
Unequivocally, yes. We've seen warming since the mid 1800s, global scale warming of close to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we've seen significant changes not only in the average temperature of the planet, but in many things we care about, many things that affect human health and where we can live. Think sea level, think intense rainfall, think intense heat, think circulation patterns, think seasonality, you know, the differences between winter and summer, something that we've done fingerprinting with. All of this has changed, not surprisingly, as we warmed up the planet by nearly 1.5 degrees by burning fossil fuels and increasing heat trapping greenhouse gases. The notion that public health would be completely unaffected by these global scale changes is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, again, this administration seeks to make those linkages not transparent, to do everything it can to make it difficult for people to understand these linkages by canceling grants that look at the inequities associated with climate change, by canceling satellite missions that provide us with information about how and why our climate is changing. Think the Orbital Carbon Observatory that provides us with information about emissions of CO2 and emissions of methane and leakages from pipelines and all that kind of stuff that you really want to know about.
Right.
If you want to understand, say, how to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, all of that is imperiled. And to me, we can't fly blind as a country or as a planet into an uncertain and perilous climate future. It makes no sense to keep people in ignorance, to deny them information that they need in order to make informed choices about where to live, about who to vote for, you know, who's taking my concerns seriously. If you remove basic information about how our planet is changing, you make it much more difficult for all of us to take informed decisions on what to do about it. That sucks.
So for example, sort of in your analogy about the chains, breaking the chain of evidence between human activity and climate change, global warming, makes it difficult to predict and prepare for such disasters, specifically, or for example, the flooding we just had in Texas and the fires we had in January down in the LA area. If we dismantle, if we break that linkage, we make it that much more difficult to be aware of things. I'll throw an example here and correct me if I'm wrong. Defunding something like NOAA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency isn't just the laying off of staff people, but it's also perhaps reducing the number of weather balloons that fly above Texas and tell us the moisture content that would give us a fair warning that could have prepared the people that tragically lost their lives, including the children at this camp that were in this flood.
Yeah, some of the things that are imperiled are basic measurements. You mentioned weather balloons. So these are twice daily measurements of the temperature and moisture of the atmosphere. People launch at dozens of locations in the US these weather balloons. They make measurements, and we use those measurements. We ingest them in weather forecast models. They help to give us a better understanding of the current state of the atmosphere, and we make a forecast 12 hours ahead, 24 hours ahead from that knowledge of the basic state. Satellites are another case in point. They provide us with temperature and moisture information that, say, informs us about atmospheric rivers that are about to slam into the coast of California. If you start laying off staff launching the weather balloons, you say, satellites, too expensive, don't really need them, then you have the real possibility of degrading weather forecasts because you have a less accurate state of what is actually happening from which to make a forecast. And that means you have worse skill. Another problem is that, as has been widely reported, some of the staff at critical centers responsible, say, for developing new hurricane track forecast models have been laid off. Why? That makes no sense.
Mhm.
These are people who are trying to develop better tools for forecasting landfalling hurricanes.
Mhm. There are now sections in California, homes that can't get a carrier because they're too much of a threat of a wildfire. So the insurance companies believe in climate change. And I'll extend that even further and say the insurance companies believe in human influenced climate change. So if business accepts it, who's this EPA guy to say, no, the sky is not blue, the sky is green?
Well, again, unfortunately, I think much of this is ideological. It's not rational. It's not economically based. It's one man, the President of the United States, saying, this is what I want to do. Fall in line, people. Otherwise, you're out of here.
Right. And the endangerment findings of 2009, the word endangerment is used for a reason because the planet and its inhabitants are in danger.
That's right. Again, just to be very clear on this point, there are very strong linkages between human-caused warming and air pollution. Think ozone in the troposphere, think particulate pollution, PM 2.5, particulate matter of a certain size. We know all of that stuff. And we know that warming, human-caused warming, exacerbates those pollution conditions that affect our health, affect asthma, affect pulmonary diseases, a whole boatload of things.
Affect where we can grow crops and raise animals.
Yeah. So that's the rationale for the endangerment finding. There is danger to human health, people, associated with human-caused climate change. This administration seemingly does not care about those dangers to human health. Plain and simple. They want to give major polluters a license to kill, a license to pollute. Sorry to be so blunt here, but that's effectively what it is.
Right.
So this should be on everyone's radar screen. Do you want to live in a country, in an environment where you can live safely and have clean air and have clean water, or not?
Mm-hmm.
That's what's at stake here.
To bring us a little bit more up to speed, you were also part of a gold standard paper.
Yeah. So the paper was in 2019, and it was a paper that was in 2019 reflecting on three anniversaries, three 40-year anniversaries, three significant events that had happened in 1979. One event was the so-called Charney Report, a report of the National Academy of Sciences led by an eminent MIT meteorologist, Jules Charney, that assessed the science of climate change back in 1979 and said, people, we have a problem. And even though back then we didn't have the kind of mature computer modeling capability that we have today, they knew enough about the basic physics to say continued fossil fuel burning is likely going to create changes in climate that will have huge socioeconomic implications for every aspect of society. They were right. This was 1979. It was seminal, this report. The second anniversary was that of the dawn of the satellite era. We began to transcend a local and regional understanding of climate to a truly global understanding of climate. With satellites, we could look at global changes in the temperature of the atmosphere from the surface right up to 50 kilometers above the surface. We could look at changes in moisture, changes in clouds, changes in atmospheric circulation patterns. And all of that was transformational in allowing people like me to do fingerprinting of the climate system. Again, that really started in 1979. The third anniversary that we celebrated in this 2019 paper was Professor Hasselmann, who I've mentioned, the director of the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology, published a paper in 1979 in which he outlined the methods of fingerprinting that many people, myself included, would subsequently use. So it was this zeitgeist back in 1979, this if you will, coincidence in the force. We started having the satellite data. We had this influential report saying climate change is real. We had pattern recognition methods. We had the climate modeling, the growing climate modeling that enabled us to try and interpret data and figure out what was going on. And that was hugely influential. Then that confluence in the force, the data, the theory, the basic modeling, and it led to what we reported on in this 2019 gold standard paper, where we did the fingerprinting with the temperature of the lower atmosphere using the satellite data, using fingerprinting methods, and showed that where we are now in terms of identifying human fingerprints on climate, we're far beyond the so-called 5 sigma gold standard that particle physicists use as a standard for discovery of new particles, like the Higgs boson. You know, they always want to know, hey, there's a really, really tiny chance that we could be wrong. In climate science, we're way beyond the 5 sigma gold standard. Way, way beyond it, unfortunately.
That paper was around the same time that you first retired during Trump 1.0. You ended up retiring from the Lawrence Livermore Lab, and as far as I can tell, you've done a very poor job as a retiree.
Yeah, I've failed pretty miserably at retirement.
Yeah.
101. So I retired from Livermore in September of 2021, and that was partly because of my run-in with Stephen Koonin, this very influential fellow, not a climate scientist, who I had already spoken about with regard to the red team, blue team thing in 2014. Livermore invited him to give a very distinguished lecture at the lab. He was going to talk about his new book in 2021, Unsettled is the title of the book, in which the premise was that climate scientists really don't understand what the heck is going on. We don't need to address climate change. Let's just all wait and see what happens. My younger colleagues at Livermore were outraged. This guy was going to present information that was in fundamental conflict with everything we had done for 30 years. I requested that we should be given equal time to rebut his arguments. That request was denied, so I decided in a very difficult and painful decision that I would sever my ties with Lawrence Livermore National Lab. I was due to retire anyway, but this meant that I didn't want to have anything to do with Livermore for the rest of my life. And that was tough. It was a tough way to end 30 years of 30 years that I had given to an organization in pursuit of science. And I left feeling like I was a piece of shit.
Are there similarities to leaving that research community behind, for lack of a better term, to what you're about to do right now and leaving a certain research community behind?
Well, this is my home. This is where I was born. Um, Leaving the U.S. is incredibly tough and sad. But science is in my blood. It's part of who I am. I want to continue doing research. I want to continue trying to advance understanding, like in this paper we just published last month, that looks at this simple thought experiment. When could we have first known that humans were affecting global climate? I want to continue doing that work, John, and I can't do that here, at least not without the very real possibility of significant negative consequences for my U.S. colleagues.
Right.
I don't want to be constrained. I want to be able to continue to do what we are doing today, to speak publicly about the harms of willful ignorance. And I want to be able to do that without having to look over my shoulder and worry about what folks are going to be doing to the funding of my colleagues.
I don't think that you would say this, but I'm going to go ahead and say this. It sounds like you're taking one for the team, or you're jumping on the grenade to spare your colleagues and collaborators at Woods Hole, at MIT, at UCLA. And again, I'm not trying to embarrass you, but is that similar to what you're doing? Are you taking one for the team and leaving the country so that this work can go on?
No, I wouldn't see it in that way.
Okay.
I'm leaving the country because I've made a personal choice. This is my choice, that I'm not going to remain silent. After 1995, I realized that I was no longer in a position to remain silent. Back then, 30 years ago, I had to say, this is what the process was that arrived at that discernible human influence finding. And here's the scientific evidence. And here's, here are the answers to criticisms of that finding back then. And ever since 1995, I've been in a position where I have to declare who I am and what we've learned and why it matters to other people. It's a burden that I assume with the greatest of reluctance, because as you mentioned, I'm happiest when I'm far from the maddening crowd. I'm happiest out there in the mountains, climbing with my son. I never sought the limelight, and I don't seek it today. But unfortunately, because of my work and because of what we've learned and published, I'm in a position where I have to declare and I have to explain in the public arena, listen, this DOE report is wrong. It misrepresents the science, and here's why. But I can't do that without the significant risk of harm to people I really care about. So I don't see it as taking one for the team. I see it as a continuation of a trajectory that started in 1995.
We started off talking about July 29th, and you had brought to my attention two things happened. One was the rescinding of the endangerment findings, but the second one was this hidden red team only 150-page report that went under the radar and is not getting attention, but is extremely significant. Are there other areas of climate science and science in general that we need to be talking about that we're not?
Yes. To me, one of the biggies is satellites. They're imperiled. The president's budget called for significant cuts to NASA. Many of those cuts were directed towards Earth observations, not only planned future satellite missions, but some existing missions. Those give us the evidentiary chain, right? The temperature measurements that enable me to do vertical fingerprinting, the measurements of volcanic aerosol in the atmosphere that enable us to better separate the human stuff from natural stuff, the measurements of the sun's energy output, again, that give us incredibly important information about a natural influence on climate. All of this is critical for doing that disentangling, the separation of what's human, what's natural, and that is all imperiled. If you break the evidentiary chain, if we decide we're not doing this anymore, then in an ideal world, other countries would take up the slack. The Europeans, the European Space Agency, China, Japan, but it ain't that easy to suddenly launch a satellite to take over all of the mission, capabilities that we currently have through NASA. That's a real concern. Degrading this measurement and monitoring capability will affect the entire world, not just us in the United States. It has huge consequences for other countries, say, that rely on U.S. Satellite data for their own weather forecasts. A lot is at stake here, John.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this political whiplash between changing administrations, the consequences are exponential compared to the perhaps more linear benefits of having a solid state direction in climate facts and climate data.
Whiplash is the right word, absolutely. And it's of great concern because, again, if you're a student thinking of coming to the United States to study or to work here, why would you do that? Why would you come given that uncertainty about what the scientific and political and social environment might be like if you come here? You could come here and then a year later it could be fundamentally different. That's a strong disincentive to the best and the brightest who might want to come here to study and to work in critically important areas.
And that's just not speaking about climate science. Science itself, I've never believed that science exists in a silo. Climate science isn't by itself. Biology depends on understanding chemistry, which depends on understanding physics. Everything depends on understanding math. So it's not just talented climate scientists that would not come to this country. It's talented scientists, minds, and innovators in general that are going to be presented from coming to this country.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you look at climate science, it's not siloed, right? You need computer scientists and mathematicians and statisticians and biologists and atmospheric chemists and folks who are capable of putting it all together and doing the systems integration, software engineers. That's what you need in order to study interdisciplinary earth science problems like climate change. And that's one of the joys, quite frankly, of working in this area, is that I get to learn from a boatload of different people who have very different expertise, but complementary expertise to my own. So when you start dismantling those big interdisciplinary climate modeling teams, you can't put them back together again, like Humpty Dumpty on the wall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put the Humpty Dumpty of climate science back together again.
Well, Ben, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with me today. I certainly hope we continue these conversations. When you go to a different area, I might have to do them in the middle of the night so that it meets your hours over there in London time. But I look forward to you continuing your work and still being a part of global climate and scientific education.
Thank you so much, John, for, first of all, giving me the opportunity to tell people a little bit about the history, because the history matters. And many folks aren't aware of 1995 and what happened back then and what fingerprinting is and what the trajectory was to get us to 2025, when we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, humans are not just innocent bystanders in the climate system. By burning fossil fuels, we're active participants in climate change. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about this stuff, and also the very thoughtful and probing questions that have covered all aspects of this issue, not just the physical science, but also uh, why it matters to people to have an understanding of the inequities of climate change, and what are the imperatives in terms of communication, in terms of doing this kind of stuff. How can we find novel ways of translating complex science in a disinformation world and getting information out there to people? So you're part of that solution. How do we, as scientists, more effectively communicate? Thanks.